This video considers the composition and appointment of the judiciary in the United Kingdom. There will be more of a focus on the UK Supreme Court, but we will look more generally at the makeup of the judiciary across the United Kingdom. So, appointments to the UK judiciary are based on merit and experience. And since 2006, the JAC, the Judicial Appointments Commission, has been set up as an independent body that appoints all judges below Supreme Court level. Now, all of those appointments used to be the responsibility of the Lord Chancellor. At the time of creating this video, 2022, Dominic Raab on the left is the Lord Chancellor. Now, in the modern age, the Lord Chancellor has a reduced role compared to traditionally. They have the power of a veto over JAC appointments. Essentially, the monarch officially vetoes the appointment, but that is on the advice of the Lord Chancellor through the Prime Minister. So again, that's a prerogative power of the monarch that is exercised by the Prime Minister. So, the problem with the old system is that the picks were quite often from small social circles. The process wasn't transparent. It undermined the separation of powers because members of the executive were choosing members of the judiciary. There was a huge proportion that came from public schools or went to Oxbridge, and the judiciary was criticised for being male, pale and stale. And so, the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 was aimed to update the method. And it didn't just lead to the creation of the UK Supreme Court, which you have learned about in the last video, but it also created the JAC, the Judiciary Appointments Commission. And the whole point of this was to give greater transparency and legitimacy to the process. And so, the previous chairman of the JAC is Lord Kakar, who you can see pictured in the centre. He was made a life peer in 2010 and is a crossbencher in the House of Lords. And so this idea of the separation of powers doesn't necessarily hold true. You can see on the right another individual, Helen Pitcher OBE. Dominic Raab named her the preferred candidate to take over as the JAC chairman and to replace Lord Kakar. Now, it's a slightly different process in the UK Supreme Court. So the qualifications you need to hold in order to be deemed suitable to sit on the Supreme Court, to qualify for a seat on the bench, is that you must have held high judicial office for 2 years, or have been a qualifying practitioner for 15 years or more, or have a senior courts qualification. In the case of Scotland, a practising advocate or a solicitor entitled to appear in the Scottish Court of Session and the High Court of Justiciary, or a member of the Bar of Northern Ireland or a solicitor of the Court of Judicature of Northern Ireland. So, do I expect you to remember all of that? Absolutely not. All you need to know is that these appointments are supposed to be based on experience and merit, and the appointments are coming from the highest courts in the land. And it seems a much less political process than it is in the United States. So, when a vacancy arises on the Supreme Court, a 5-member committee, an independent commission, considers nominations and makes a selection. They then submit that selection to the Lord Chancellor, who I said, as at the time of creating this video, is Dominic Raab. He can do 3 things. First of all, the Lord Chancellor can reject the suggestion. He can send the suggestion back to the Commission and ask them to reconsider, or he can accept their nomination by notifying the Prime Minister of the decision. And then the Prime Minister officially recommends the individual to the monarch, and that is when the monarch plays their official role, which is to confirm the appointment to the Supreme Court. So it is a more transparent process. It does seem to have more legitimacy than the last process, but as you can see, we still have the significant involvement of the executive, of the Lord Chancellor and the Prime Minister. Less so than used to be the case. The Independent Commission essentially chooses the candidate, but the Lord Chancellor can officially veto any appointment they make. Now, we don't necessarily have a particularly politicised process in the UK like they do in the United States, but there is the potential for that system to become politicised. So let's talk about the composition of both the UK Supreme Court and the judiciary in general. So one criticism is that the Supreme Court is male, pale and stale. Essentially that it's filled with old white men. And you can see their profiles from the UK Supreme Court website there. 11 of the 12 members of the Supreme Court are men. They are all white. And the youngest is Lord Sales, who is aged 60. 11 of the 12 went to Oxbridge. The only one who didn't is Lord Stevens, who went to the University of Manchester. And if you look at high school education, there's an overwhelming majority of people who were educated at private or grammar schools too. Now, there's a lack of diversity generally. Just 35% of all court judges in 2022 were women. Only 10% of all judges in 2022 came from an ethnic minority. 5% Asian, 1% black, 2% of mixed heritage, and 1% of other heritage. So we can see that in the British judiciary, we have the dominance of white men. And that leads us to our final discussion, whether it matters. Should the UK Supreme Court be more diverse? So the question that we're going to look at is, does the lack of diversity matter? Now, this table, these opinions come from the revision guide for paper 1. So the arguments for yes, this lack of diversity does matter. This is the idea that the judiciary doesn't reflect modern British societies, that the judiciary may not be able to understand the cultural context of some cases. Another argument to suggest that it matters is that it isn't becoming more diverse. Diversity in the court isn't improving. So you couldn't make the case, well, it may not be reflective of society now, but it will be, because that doesn't seem to be happening if you look at recent appointments to the Supreme Court. The public may see the Supreme Court as a tool of the establishment to uphold the dominant class's way of life. And then finally, if we had some element of democratically elected representatives in the appointments process, it may lead to a more diverse court. We'll talk about maybe the pitfalls of that and make a comparison to the United States in a moment. So, there are some arguments to suggest that no, it does not matter. The first one is that we shouldn't view judges in the way that we view our MPs. They are not representatives of the people. They are there to interpret the law. And so their expertise is necessary. Secondly, judges are not there to empathise, but to apply the law neutrally and professionally. So they are not there to sympathise with the individuals in the case or to try and empathise with their position, rather to look at the letter of the law and see if it applies. Another argument is that diversity is greater and growing lower down the hierarchy. Looking at the information we looked at before, 35% women and 10% ethnic minorities in 2022. I'm not sure I can completely get on board with that argument. If I was evaluating that point, I'd say that there's very little evidence to suggest that it is becoming more diverse at the moment. Argument number 4 is that the public are better off having decisions in the hands of the best qualified, and that there is no evidence of this idea of upholding the status quo of the dominant class. You could look at the way in which the human rights legislation has been interpreted by the UK Supreme Court and has gone against the government in some key decisions. And then finally, this idea of democratically elected representatives appointing Justices, this would certainly politicise the process, and the politicisation of the process in the United States has made a mockery of the independence of the Supreme Court. And you can see that process if you wanted to do some further research into the selection of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court in the 1990s, or maybe in more recent years, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court during the Trump years. The involvement of politicians means that the judiciary itself becomes political, and it's no coincidence that Donald Trump makes 3 appointments to the US Supreme Court shortly before Roe versus Wade, which guaranteed the right to an abortion in every state in America, was overturned.